Dr. Charlie Bamforth joins me to discuss his long career in brewing. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 334. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 334, and it's late October 2025. Dr. Charlie Bamforth joins me this week to discuss his long career in brewing. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for home brewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith for the web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Dr. Charlie Bamforth, Professor Emeritus of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California at Davis. Charlie specializes in the study of wholesomeness of beer, including beer perception, polyphenols, foam stability, oxidation, and flavor stability. Charlie, it's a pleasure to have you on. How are you doing?
Doing good. It's nice to be with you again. Done a lot of these over the years. Like 15, I think. But anyway. So.
Yeah, I think we're up around there at least. This is episode, 334 we're at now. So that's
my word. No, I'm good.
I guess.
I'm good. I'm still busy and still life in the old dog yet.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. What have you been doing the last year? We had you on about a year ago.
Yeah, well, continuing to advise Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, which I'm very proud to do. That's been 6 years. This is my last year, so I will be moving on at the end of December. But I continue to be involved in the brewing industry. I'm still doing work with continuing professional education at UC Davis. Every Monday I get a notification of how many people are signing up for some of the courses through Coursera. You can actually do quality courses by foam, flavor stability, color and haze, and quality systems through Coursera. You don't have to pay anything unless you want a certificate. Then you've got to dig deep.
I think you mentioned Coursera before. Can you talk a little bit about that, maybe?
Yeah, Coursera is I don't know that much about it, but it is an online education vehicle, and UC Davis decided that 5 of my quality classes could go on there. And as I say, people can use it as part of their education. And as I say, if they do pay a fee, they can sort of get certification for passing the course and so on. But if you're just interested in learning a bit more about bubbles and flavor and so on and so forth, you don't have to pay anything. You can listen to the lectures free of charge. Those are lectures I did years ago in the days when you'd go into a studio and record it. And these days you sit in front of your laptop and record it. So, but we do a lot of other stuff with continuing professional education. So we have the master brewers and so on. So I continue to do that before I go totally gaga. And still writing quite a lot. And busy, I'll be in England in October doing several presentations. One for Sierra Nevada, a beer dinner actually for Sierra Nevada in London, and if anybody listens from London and they'd like to be there, I can certainly let you have the information on when and where. And I'm doing a couple of talks for the Chartered Institute of Brewers and Distillers on the image of beer and how we need to work to resurrect the image of beer and convince people of all ages that in moderation it's still just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And I'll also be doing quite a bit at Nottingham. I'm still an honorary professor at Nottingham University, and I'll be doing some stuff with them in Nottingham as well.
Pretty busy for a retired guy, huh?
Yeah, yeah, keeps me out of mischief, you know.
Well, today you wanted to share a few stories from your long career, and I've actually never heard the whole thing, so I'm very interested as well. Um, you started, I think, at BRF, which you joined in 1978. Can you start there, perhaps?
Yeah, I studied at the University of Hull, biochemistry. I did my PhD there, and then I was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Microbiology at the University of Sheffield. And when you're a postdoc, it's a 2 year stint. And so your first year, you're beavering away trying to get the best possible work done and as many papers as possible. And the second year, you're a bit distracted. You start looking at the job pages in New Scientist and Nature and so on. And I saw an advertisement in the New Scientist. They wanted an enzymologist, which I was, at the Brewing Research Foundation, BRF, in Nutfield, Surrey. And I thought, well, that's all right. That's right up my street in at least two ways. So I went down for interview. The BRF was a fascinating organization. It was established as the Brewing Industry Research Foundation, BIRF. They dropped the I. It was established just after the war, Second World War, as a central location for doing fundamental research on beer and malting beer, hops, and so on. Fundamental research to really get bottom out the basic science technology of brewing. And the way it was paid for was by basically a tax on barrels of beer in the UK. So for every barrel of beer, there were a few pennies that went off and was earmarked to pay for the Brewing Research Foundation. And also there were brewers from overseas, particularly the old Antipodes, Australia and New Zealand, who also were members. And so it was fundamental research. It was idyllic location, really, big country house. That during the war had been the domicile for the Canadian Air Force officers, but now it was converted into laboratories. So my laboratory was a bedroom somewhere, and so all these eager young scientists are doing pretty fundamental research, and things went pretty well for me. I was working on things like cell walls and the breakdown of the cell walls, and I coined the phrase or the words beta-glucan solubilase for solubilization of beta-glucans by an enzyme, and did a lot of work on DMS and the control of DMS. And when I became the head of one of the teams there and was promoted to principal scientist, I was leading the work on hydrophobic proteins in foam, and the very earliest work on oxygen radicals and reactive oxygen species, things like superoxide and hydroxyl. Started to do that work as well. So, doing a lot of pretty fundamental research. And at Nutfield, of course, we were beholden to the brewers, primarily the British brewers. And they paid in proportion to how many barrels of beer they brewed. So the biggest paymasters at BRF were Bass, because Bass was easily the biggest brewing company. But of course, we also had Allied and Courage and Watley's and Scottish and Newcastle and Guinness and so many more. And the brewing companies interacted with the people at Nutfield, and basically they were headhunting. So it was an exercise in not only getting fundamental, relevant research done, but also it was, where you recruited your own scientists from. And to cut a long story short, Bass decided they liked the cut of me. So I joined Bass in 1983. The true story is this, that I was, I'd been there 5 years. So I was going to get a little bit demob happy, and I wanted to have a new challenge. And I really fancied myself at the time as a university teacher, a professor. And at the time, Imperial College in London, a very prestigious college, they were establishing a new department of biotechnology. And this was 19. When this would be 1982.
Yeah,
Early
you moved to Bass
1983.
in '83, so
83, yeah. So I went to interview at Imperial College, and I found them very pompous. Uh, and I thought, well, I'm not going to get this job, so I'll just let him have it with both barrels. So I probably rude, actually. I was probably rude. I thought, I'm not going to tolerate your arrogance, you know. And the guy, the professor there, the head, he loved it. He thought it was fantastic because he was a Yorkshireman and I'm a Lancastrian, and we're up in the north, and we talk bluntly. So I thought, he said, the job's yours. So I said, that's very nice, thank you. And I went home and I said to my wife, Diane, I said, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel right at all. I really, and it doesn't appeal to me. Anyway, next day I went into Nutfield to BRF, and I went in to see the Director General, a guy called Bernard Atkins. And I said, Bernard, I'm leaving. He said, yes, I know. I said, well, I'm going to Imperial College. He said, no, you're not. You're going to Bath. and he said, I've been negotiating your move there for quite a while now, and you're going to Bath. And I thought, wow, that's fantastic. Not only because I was going to the Midlands, staying in the brewing industry, but also it was the nearest I would ever get to my favorite football club, Wolverhampton Wanderers, who I'd been a dedicated supporter of since 1962. And this is now I was going to be able to get a season ticket to sit in the stands at Wolverhampton Wanderers. So yeah, marvelous. So we went to Bath.
Awesome. So what'd you do at Bass, though? I mean, obviously, at the time, the biggest brewer in the UK, right?
Yeah, and they had a big research department, very prestigious research department. Those are the days when brewing companies all over the world had big research teams. So they were in the UK. They were not only supporting the Brewing Research Foundation, but they also, each of these brewing companies had their own research team, and the biggest by far was Bass. And the top technical guy was a guy called Tony Portlow. And under him, there was the research manager called Stuart Maltzahn. And so I went into that team, heading up a smallish group, 3 or 4 people, doing the fundamental chemistry, biochemistry work. And then within a year, Tony Portnoy had got promoted. So Stuart Malzahn was promoted, and they promoted me to research manager. So this was early in 1984. I became the research manager of Bass. So what was I wasn't quite 32 years of age.
Wow.
And now I'm running the research team at Bass. It was 20 or 30 people. So we had a strong team working on raw materials and malt, people like Roy Parsons and Roy Cope, an excellent yeast team. And some of your listeners will probably have read the book by Bolton and Quain. So Chris Bolton, who I'd known from my university days, and David Quain, they were running the yeast work. Fantastic team. We had a team working on genetics, molecular biology. Of course, we had a sensory team, new product development team, and so on. So we were doing a lot of fundamental work and publishing it as well. And so we were sort of, on the one hand, paying for BRF, but we're also trying to compete with them to be first into press. So this is when we did the fundamental work on really the depth on superoxides and reactive oxygen species, Parsons and myself. So at the Brewing Congress of the Americas in 1984, that's when we published the very first paper talking about reactive oxygen species and how it was oxygen radicals caused by action of copper and iron was really the culprit. That was in St. Louis, 1984, the very first time I ever went to America. And I'm still reminded of it to this day because it was September 1984. And our second child, Caroline, she was born. She was due to arrive when I was in St. Louis, but she very, very obligingly arrived 2 days early. So I was there for the birth, and then I got on an airplane to go to America. And my late mother-in-law often recalled that story. But
I'm sure your wife didn't forget it either.
no, we were talking about it only this week. But by the way, that daughter, Caroline, she these days is doing a very nice job at the Department of Viticulture and Enology at UC Davis. But
That's awesome.
that's another story. So we were doing a lot of pretty fundamental work. In fact, out of the Bass Research Department, there was an offshoot called Delta Biotechnology, which was set up to deliberately and to genetically modify yeast and to use genetically modified yeast for all sorts of purposes other than the brewing of beer. And that Delta Biotechnology, which we set up in Nottingham, grew to being twice the size of the research department at Bass in Burton.
Wow.
So I was responsible for new product development as well. That was in the team. And I often say to people these days, if I'd said, hey, we think it'd be a great idea to work on and produce a hazy beer, I would have been let go pretty quickly. But we came up with all sorts of things, beers, Tennant's Pilsner, for example, and lots of other drinks as well. I was responsible for reformulating our alcohol-free beer, which was called Barbican. So we were big into alcohol-free beers those days, lower alcohol beers as well. I think we've talked about those before. So I was, and of course, interacting with all the different breweries in the group. We had 13 breweries in Bath at the time. And so we had to do all the work that was relevant to all those individual breweries, things like clarification, isinglass fining, so on. And Parsons and I wrote the control document for how we would control the level of DMS in Carling Lager. And I don't really want to go into that discussion any more than it's already been aired on your show. But let me tell you that the control was all to do with the level of SMM in the malt, and all to do with the length of the boil and the length of the whirlpool stand.
Sure.
For the simple reason that at Bass, our malt was dried at temperatures. The kilning temperature did not go above 65 degrees Celsius. So our malt did not contain any DMSO. But let's not go into that any more detail.
Well, you continued at Bass. You were running a fairly sizable group as a young man until 1991, and then what made you transition back to BRF after all that?
Well, there was an intermediate stage there, and this was due to Tony Portnow, but more especially to a guy called Gus Guthrie, who very sadly has just died. And I will be at his funeral in a couple of weeks' time. Gus Guthrie said, Charlie, you've been at BRF, you've been in Burton-on-Trent, you've done 10 years in the Ivory Tower, and you've got to have the smooth edges knocked off. You've got to be seen to go into the real world. And so in 1988, I was moved to the brewery at Bass Preston Brook Brewery. It used to be called Runcorn, which was a big brewery close to Liverpool, just in North Cheshire, just south of the River Mersey. And it was capable, that brewery, which was started and commissioned in 1974, it was capable of 2 million UK barrels. And remember, a UK barrel is 1.6 hectolitres. So it was a big brewery. And it was heavily unionized. And I was sent there as the QA manager. And I had a team in the quality team, 30 people in the quality team. And I think at the time we were actually brewing just over 1 million barrels. The brewery was located there strategically because it really is at the intersection of northwest, north-south, west-east transportation. So in terms of what we call motorways or freeways and rail links and so on, and not far from the docks either, it was a pretty good location. But But as I say, it was heavily unionized, and it was almost anarchy in terms of what was going on. And also, it was a very badly designed brewery. It was very horizontal. There were long pipelines that were going, across the campus and threw all the gases out of spec, and it was just a mess. But because basically of the union problems, they actually closed the brewery in 1992. So it started in 70. It only lasted 18 years, this brewery. Huge brewery. But the Bass couldn't handle it any longer. So I was there from 88 to 91 as the QA manager. And quite honestly, Brad, I hated it. But I learned a hell of a lot. I really, throughout my life, if there's any stage in it where I really learned the most, that was when I was the QA manager of Preston Brew. Because, you can't read some of the things in textbooks. You've got to live it. And so to fundamentally understand the practical realities, which you'll never do unless you've left the ivory tower and gone into the sharp end. I'm eternally grateful to Gus Guthrie and Tony Portnow for insisting that I would do that. But after a couple of years, I thought this is not for me. So I said
if I recall, that brewery had kind of a notorious reputation too, because of poor design, the management, and everything else, right?
Everything. There. I don't think there's a book on it, but there is certainly some detailed articles digging into what really was the problem there. They were immense. But as I say, I learned a lot. But I turned back to Gus and Tony. I said, well, look, I've done it now. I've served my time. It's time for me to come back. And they said, well, Charlie, there's no job for you. I said, well, I'm leaving. They said, you can't leave. I said, well, watch me. And they said, look, they want a director of research at BRF. Mm-hmm. They're looking for a director of research. We're still the biggest paymasters. Would you go back? Temporarily, before we're ready to bring you back to Burton, would you go back? And so I said, yeah. I met with Bernard Atkinson. I said, all right. And they actually paid for my relocation. So Bass actually paid
for you to go to BRF?
Paid for me to go back. All the relocation, the housing, the fees, and all the legal costs, and everything was paid for by Bass, because they reckoned that I'd be there, I'd still be looking after their interests, and then they'd get me back to Bass at the right time.
Wow.
What they didn't realize, of course, at that time was that Margaret Thatcher had spent some time with Ronald Reagan, and he'd convinced her that the British brewing industry was a monopoly. So Bass, and we may have had this conversation before, I don't know, but Bass, we not only had our own 13 breweries, we also had our own malt houses, but we also had 6,350 pubs. So it was vertical integration. And so we worried, and we quality-wise, it's the best possible scenario. You really are caring about your product right the way through to the end. And particularly if you're dealing with things like draft Bass and all the things that can go wrong with cask ale, it really does make sense to own your own pubs. But Thatcher said, that's too many. You can't own all those pubs. You got to sell them. So, all bar 2,000. I think she relented on that number as well. But that's basically, like all the other brewery companies, decided, well, do we brew beer and not own the outlets, or do we own the outlets and not brew the beer? And where do you make the profit? You make the profit in the pubs. So one by one, all the big brewing companies sold their breweries. And Bass sold all of their breweries to Interbrew in Belgium. And then she said, well, that's still too big. That's too big. So Interbrew, which of course became AB InBev, sold half of them to Coors. So that's why you have Coors in Burton now. That's why my pension actually is a Molson Coors pension these days, because Coors inherited the pension plan from Bass. So there was no job for me to go back to. I certainly wasn't going to go back to a pub company. So I was at BRF from 1991, and this is when we were moving to become BRF International. Mm-hmm. So rather than just rely automatically on a tax on beer in the UK and automatic funding, it was all changed so that now it was optional. So if you were a brewing company in the UK, you no longer had to be a member of BRF. But BRFI, or BRF International, BRFI, but now we were encouraged, indeed it was essential, that we recruited members all over the world, which we did. As director of research, my role was to run a research program which satisfied everybody, which isn't easy, let me tell you.
No, I would think not.
And also that meant I did a huge amount of international travel. So we had all the Australian brewing industry, New Zealand, South Africa. We had Asahi and Kirin in Japan. We had Heineken. We had Miller, as was then in the United States. So I spent a lot of time with the Miller Brewing Company in Milwaukee, and many more. Part of my role was not only running the research program, but also, drumming up membership and trying to get members for BRF. The Miller story is quite an amusing one. There was a guy called Art Rayberger, was the top technical guy there, and he had two guys came to BRF International with him, a guy called Jerry Seeby and another one called Etsuchi Koya. Mm-hmm. And they brought their wives with them, and we were negotiating Miller joining BRFI. And Bernard Atkinson said to me, he said, well, I'm going to take the chaps out tonight and wine and dine them and seal the deal. Please, would you escort the women to the theatre in London? So I took the women up to Les Miserables in London, and boxes of chocolates in the box and so on and so forth. And I'm pretty sure that I clinched the Miller deal.
That's probably the case, I would think, yeah.
So Miller became members. I spent a lot of time visiting Milwaukee and lots of other places as well. But I also toured over right away across the States trying to get different companies as members of BRF International.
That's great.
So then Bernard retired. And so in terms of research that we were doing at the time, John Hammond was doing came up with the world's first accepted genetically modified yeast. Mm-hmm. We were lots of fundamental work on so many other things. But then Bernard retired, and I rather wanted the job, didn't get it, and they brought in a guy from outside called Renton Rigolato. And without going into too much detail, Nutfield wasn't big enough for the both of us, so I decided to look elsewhere.
Well, along the way, you actually started as a visiting professor at Heriot-Watt, I think.
Yeah, I did.
What drove you into teaching? Because it sounded like that was a passion of yours for some time.
Well, that was it. So, I mentioned Imperial College earlier on, and it appealed to me then because it's in the genes. My father and his father before him were all school headmasters. My mother was a teacher. Wow. So the teaching was in the blood. At Heriot-Watt at the time in Edinburgh, a very long-standing school studying beer, the professor was my closest friend in the brewing industry, Graham Stewart. And Graham had been the top technical guy at the Labatt Brewing Company in London, Ontario. And I had a lot of dealings with him. They were members of BRF International. So again, I used to spend a lot of time in London, Ontario. Graham actually is a Welshman. He's from Cardiff. So he went to Heriot-Watt as the professor, and he said, would I be interested in becoming the visiting professor of brewing there? And I would go up there and give lectures and be part of their advisory committee and so on. So that was great. So I would quite frequently fly up to Edinburgh to spend time at Heriot-Watt University. So when I, in my last days at BRF International, or we were now BRI, And before I forget it, after I'd left, BRI merged with a research organization called Camden Research, which is a food research organization in the Midlands of England. And they merged to become Camden BRI. And just in the last couple of years, they have closed the old location at Nutfield. So it's desperately sad that they've actually closed the Nutfield site where, I spent my formative years in the brewing industry and then went back. So that's all closed down now. It's very sad. Anyway, people kept bombarding me with advertisements from, all over the place, saying they were looking for a professor of brewing, the Anheuser-Busch Endowed Professor of Malting and Brewing Science at University of California, Davis. And people kept sending it to me saying, hey, this has been written for you. This is you, because they wanted somebody who had a long research record in brewing, somebody who had been in the industry, worked in the industry, and somebody who had an academic presence. So, Bass,
there you go.
BRI, Harriet Watt. And so I applied. Well, eventually I applied. My wife, I have 3 kids, Peter, the eldest, Caroline, and little Emily, as was at the time. Little Emily, she was very young. And we debated, yes, we'll go, no, we won't, and so on. Eventually I did apply, and the rest is history. So I arrived at Davis in February 1999 as the first Anheuser-Busch Endowed Professor.
And I know you were instrumental in expanding the program there. It's now a world-renowned brewing program, obviously.
Well, in fairness to my predecessor, Michael Lewis, he did a great job as a teacher. I mean, he always was an excellent teacher, and developed and trained an awful lot of people, and a lot of them went to Anheuser-Busch, and eventually they got to places where they were close to checkbooks, and therefore they were able to endow the professorship at UC Davis and so on. So Michael laid the territory, but what I inherited really was facilities that hadn't really changed at all since 1958, when the very first brewery, a pilot brewery, was put into UC Davis by the Lucky Lager Brewing Company. So the students were still learning on this old piece of equipment, and the laboratory was pretty decrepit. So the very first morning when I arrived in Davis, I had breakfast with Anheuser-Busch, and they said, you need a new brewery. And I said, I have to agree. And basically they helped install themselves with the Anheuser-Busch company. They actually sent engineers over to UC Davis, and they built a new brewery.
Wow!
So in the old building. So that was the first thing. But then I went out and about and got support from many people to help support the program. So Anheuser-Busch were there, of course, but the very first person I went to see was Ken Grossman in Chico, and Ken said, yeah, I will support you, but you've got to make sure it's not just me and Anheuser-Busch. You've really got to get others as well, which I did. So we had support from all over the world. So I was calling in some old contacts from, South Africa, Japan, and so on, and they were very generous to the program. So I, basically inherited the upper division the lecture class, but also the practical class as well. Mm-hmm. But I also started a brand new introductory class, which was a general education class, where I ran it 3 times a year. We had more than 1,000 students in a year would take this class. Wow. And they loved it. They voted it the most popular class on campus. Previously, the most important class had been on human relations, and the third one, nutrition. The next one, nutrition. So officially, the beer class became of more interest to the students than the sex and the food classes. But
interesting.
Yes, so I was very pleased with that. And then I became the chairman of the Department of Food Science and Technology, which is the department that the brewing program has always been in.
Mm-hmm.
And a guy called Robert Mondavi and his wife Margaret, they gave a huge amount of money to the university to establish, to get some new buildings. And I was the chairman of food science. And so now there's fantastic buildings that house the Department of Food Science and Technology and the Department of Viticulture and Enology. But also we needed to find a home for the brewery. And so I raised another $10 million dollars to put in a new brewery and food processing facility. And then we moved the brewery over as well. It shows how sophisticated it is. It cost $120,000 just to move the brewery from one location to another.
That's crazy.
It's a fantastic facility.
So, Charlie, we've never really talked about the program there. What kind of programs do you offer under the brewing science program?
So there's two ways to study brewing at UC Davis. One is as a campus student, but the other one is through what we used to call extension. These days is called continuing professional education. So, on campus, as I say, the brewing program is within the Department of Food Science and Technology. And when I retired in 2018, it was my successor was a guy called Glenn Fox. So Michael Lewis is Welsh. I'm English. Glenn Fox is Australian. So it seems like the criterion that you have to have is that you come from somewhere else. But whether that will be the case in the future, who knows? So there's teaching, there's research, and there's outreach. That's the responsibility of any professor at UC Davis. And the part I enjoyed the most was obviously the teaching. So I taught undergraduate classes. I mentioned the open class, the general education class, FST3, and that's open. So freshmen or anybody they need to have a science class, and that qualified as a science general education class. So we had lots of people who were studying, I don't know, French and who knows what, textiles and so on. But they were studying brewing, and some of them it whetted their appetite. Then there was the upper division classes, and to get into the upper division classes on malting and brewing science, both the lab class and the lecture class, people had to have a lot of prereqs. They had to have chemistry and biochemistry and microbiology and chemical engineering and all of these things. They have to have done those courses separately first before they could do the malting and brewing science. Because as everybody knows, all sorts of different sciences are involved in brewing, and you got to understand them before you can really make sense of the brewing. But we didn't. There's no degree in brewing at UC Davis. Okay. You can't walk out of UC Davis with a certificate that says Bachelor of Science Brewing. You could be a food scientist, but you could be a chemical engineer. You could be a viticulture and enology student, but you've done the brewing class. Because we felt that it was, just in case you don't want to become a brewer, it's a bit restricted to have a piece of paper which says BS Brewer when you want to do something completely different. But BS Food Science, it opens those doors. The research, most professors of brewing across the world, they do their research using PhD students. But I never did that. I use master's students. And people say, well, Charlie, you got a PhD. Yeah, I said, I know, but I got it in England in 3 years, not in 5 years. And when people like Anheuser-Busch and other people came to interview students, they would say to them, why have you spent 5 years doing a PhD? It's not going to help you become a brewer. We want you to have the brewing knowledge, but it's far better to have spent your time practically doing useful things and learning on the job than it is by doing PhDs. Now, of course, as a professor, I needed to have research done, but I found it very effective to have a series of excellent master's students. And mostly they would get at least one paper out of it, and in some instances, 2 or 3 papers. In one instance, I think 5 papers out of a master's thesis, And then I felt they were, in 2 years, they were groomed and ready. And indeed, So it is the case. They've gone on to many different brewing companies, large and small. So all over the industry, there are graduates. And Michael Lewis had the same philosophy as well. So he didn't do PhDs either.
So did you not sponsor any PhD students? I'm sure you must have done a few, right?
Well, I was certainly involved in guiding PhD candidates and so on, and I had PhD students in the UK that were associated with me. So when I was at Bass, I had 2 or 3 PhD students going through my old alma mater, the University of Hull, with my old PhD supervisor. So yeah, I had PhDs indirectly. And of course, I had many PhD people working for me at BRF and BRF International and Bass. But in terms of somebody saying my primary professor for a PhD is Charlie Bamforth, then the answer is very few and far between. And my colleagues at UC Davis couldn't understand it. Why, you don't have PhDs? And I said, no, because I view my role as developing people to become brewers or people in the brewing industry. And the numbers of jobs, these days that demand a PhD in the brewing industry are few and far between.
Sure.
The days when you had the Millers and the Labatts and the Basses with the big research teams, they're gone. They're gone. I became the editor of the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists, and very few papers would come from U.S., European brewing companies. More from Europe than the U.S., and more from Japan than Europe. But as regards brewing companies in the U.S., not so much. Sierra Nevada have a good little research team, but it is a fairly small team. And at the current time, I don't think any of them have a PhD. I felt very strongly that I would do it all through masters, and we published a hell of a lot of paper. I still don't think any.
No, I think it's obviously you've got huge number of citations.
Yeah, I don't think anybody published more.
Yeah. Can you tell me just a little bit more about the continuing education program, professional program?
Yeah. Again, the what was the Master Brewers program that was started by Michael Lewis, and I when I came here in 1999, I started to teach that as well, and so I've been teaching that program now since 1999. So what are we? 26 years. So basically, the Master Brewers program, you can do it 2 ways these days. You can actually do it in the classroom. We have a classroom at the Sudwork Brewery in Davis, or you can do it online. So basically, it is very intense, in detail curriculum, basically grinding us very fine on all aspects of malting and brewing, with a lot of practical work as well. If you're doing it online, you come after the event. You come right at the end of the course, and you do a boot camp in Davis if you want. So we have people all over the world. The advantage of doing it in Davis is, like anything else, if you can feel the spittle of the professor on your cheek, and you can interact with other students. There's much to be said for that. But you are in Davis for 2 or 3 months. And
Sure.
That means you're not somewhere else brewing beer. If you're doing it online, you can do the day job and you can learn alongside it. So there's pros and cons for both of these things. And as I said, there are shorter courses as well that are online. So we're very proud of our program. And again, obviously, we take full advantage of the facilities we've got now. But it's great to have a permanent classroom at the Sudwork Brewery as well. And that's, it's a new classroom, or relatively new classroom, but we had an older classroom. So as long as I've been in Davis, the short courses have been taught at the Sudwork Brewery. So again, we have the student, many of them. There's an assortment of people. In the last class, we had a guy who had got burnout from his career in the IT industry, and he wanted to learn about brewing, so you think of opening a brewery. And we also had a lot of people from Brazil and Argentina employed by a very large brewing company down there who every year send their students or send their brewers, a hand-picked set of brewers from different breweries up to Davis to learn about the fundamentals.
Awesome.
And so it's a real mixture. And just 2 weeks ago, one of this year's students, I bumped into him in Chico, and he's just been signed up by Sierra Nevada. So it's
Nice.
it's great. It's invigorating, and I strongly recommend it.
And of course,
we think it's the best there is.
Yeah. Of course, you retired in 2018, but you've hardly slowed down. I think the last 6 years you've been working for Sierra Nevada, right? Doing an advisory role.
Yeah, senior quality advisor. So,
what are you doing for them?
Love every minute. Well, I most of it is done remotely, but I go up to Chico quite a bit and over to Mills River. I'll be over in Mills River in November, which I've probably said before is the most beautiful brewery in the world. And I do a lot of advisory work, obviously on quality. If there are quality issues, I get involved in those. And again, I do a lot of teaching as well, a lot of educational stuff, a lot of presentations. I record a lot of lectures for them as well. Ken Grossman, as you know, is a great guy. And when I first came on board, he said, "Charlie, your job is to tell me what I need to hear, not necessarily what I want to hear." So the very first thing I said, "You don't want to hear this." And when I told him what it was, he said, "No, I don't want to hear that." But I've been very proud and continue to be proud that I've worked with Sierra Nevada. I do. It will come to an end this year.
Yeah, you mentioned.
So I can look back on those 6 years with great fondness. I mean, it all started when I'd retired. Ken said, just before I retired from UC Davis, "Come up and have lunch." So I went up. He said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "I'm retiring." He said, "No, you're not." And I've said this several times. You know, I would not have said yes to anybody else. It's just an astonishing brewing company.
That's awesome. And of course, along the way, you wrote more books than I can count, I think. Can you just give us a couple of the highlights?
Well, there's 4 more on the way.
My.
One of them already, the manuscript is with the American Society of Brewing Chemists. It's a book of basically questions and answers. So, you know, I've obviously done a lot of work educationally. I used to be an examiner for the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, as it was then. And so I've put a book together, which is lots of short questions, lots of interpretive questions, like, can I give people all these analyses on barley? You've got to interpret what's going on with these different barleys and malts and hops and worts and beers. A lot of essay type questions, a lot of challenges. You know, you've got a new managing director who's not happy with your bubble. You know, those are not the exact words. Get to the bottom of why there's a problem. And these are sorts of exercises used in the CPE class and so on. So it basically is a book. Obviously, I give them all the questions, but also I give the answers in the end, or my interpretation of the answers. So hopefully it's a great learning tool for anybody who is trying to study brewing, whether it's within a course or on their own. I just also, with Oxford University Press, there's a new book on food fermentations. So it's one of my beer books, my longest standing beer book, which is now in its 4th edition, is called Beer: Tap into the Art and Science of Brewing. And that's with Oxford University Press these days. And I said, how about something similar, but not just beer, other foods as well, you know, bread, cheese, wine, spirits, soy sauce, kimchi, all those. So that book is a reader-friendly, layman's look at food, fermented foods.
Nice.
And then I'm editing something for Elsevier with a lot of different authors, all on all the relevant aspects of beer and brewing in the current time, right the way through from raw materials, ales, lagers, hazy beers, environment, health and safety, genetically modified organisms, and so on. Alternative products coming from breweries. So that is due to be completed before the end of the year. And a little bit of a different one for me. I'm doing a layman's guide to chemical engineering for brewers.
Oh wow!
I've been crying out for people to write a chemical engineer somewhere to write a book on chemical engineering for brewers, and I collaborating with 3 people who fell by the wayside. So I decided to do it myself. So I call it a layman's introduction to chemical engineering, because that's exactly what it is. But I'm enjoying doing it, because it ain't awesome. That difficult. It isn't that difficult at all. So it will be written as from a non-chemical engineering perspective, and I will be checking everything with a chemical engineer or 2. But hopefully that will be also completed early in next year.
Wow. And of course,
I continue to write it. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say no discussion would be complete without your discussion of your book on soccer goalies. And of course, your long fascination with soccer.
Yeah, that's an interesting story there as well. There's when I talk about beer styles, I talk about all the different beer styles, and including mild ale, English mild ale. And the example I always give is Bunks's mild ale from Wolverhampton, which happens to be the home of my team, Wolverhampton Wanderers. As I say, I first watched my first Wolves game in 1962. And by the way, playing left wing for Wolves that day, there's a guy called Alan Hinton, and I helped him write his autobiography. So that was my second soccer book, if you must have, football book. And I still write for the Wolves Heroes website. Anyway, Bunks's brewery these days is owned by Carlsberg. And in their wisdom, Carlsberg decided they were going to close it down after 150 years, which is actually two years older than Wolverhampton Wanderers. So the guys at Bunks's said, Charlie, would you come over and just say a few words at a party, basically, we're having to celebrate the employees. So I because of the beer hat, and also because of the Wolves hat. So I said a few words, and I was introduced as the guy who wrote the book on Wolves goalkeepers. And at which point, through the door came one of the former Wolves goalkeepers. And so they actually lined up a guy who actually was only a kid when I wrote that book, but went on to be the Wolves and the Young England goalkeeper, guy called Matt Murray, who retired a few years ago. Lovely guy. So he and I had a lot to talk about. And that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be the Wolves goalkeeper. My problem was I was only 5'8", and there were other goalkeepers of that height at the time. 5'8.5". There were other professional goalkeepers at that time, but Matt Murray stood by me. I forget what he is. I think he's 6'5".
Wow.
And I just looked and I said, I think I now know why I didn't make it. But and it was very, very sad. So closing that brewery down is desperately sad.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of good breweries closing at the moment, which is
it's pretty miserable. It's pretty miserable.
I mean, we were just talking before the show about several of the craft breweries that closed down just in the last week or two. It's a little depressing.
If you look back at the history of beer, I mean, I mentioned Bass a lot. I mean, Bass grew to the size they did by acquiring other breweries. That simply is how it was done. They progressively got bigger and bigger and bigger by acquiring different breweries, and usually, closing them down and keeping the pubs. So there's a long history of that. It's the whole history is one of companies coming and going. And of course, in the States with the craft, it's been so exciting over so many years. Seeing
that was actually my next question, Charles. I was going to ask you about what's your opinion? You were right in the middle of the rise of the craft beer revolution. Educating people, participating in it, and everything else. Where do you think we're going with all of this?
Well, I mean, it's depressing at the moment. But it's still the case that if you've got a good business model and you know how to brew beer and you do it in a responsible way, then there's hope. And there's some brewers that are, including Sierra Nevada, that are still nudging forward, whereas some of us are now losing. Hold fast, I think, is the idea. And I'm going to be doing this in the UK in the next couple of weeks, spreading the gospel about why beer deserves more respect, why beer really needs to be celebrated more. And I'm talking beer, and I'm well aware of all companies that are diversifying into all sorts of other beverages. I understand why. But I do think there's a very, very good case to celebrate beer for the fact that it is a wholesome beverage in moderation, and it is an interesting beverage, and it is a responsible beverage, and many beers can be relatively low in alcohol. They don't have to be alcohol-free or down there. They can be somewhere in the middle. And, in terms of, dining experiences and so much can be done to energize people around beer and hopefully capture the younger element that it's okay to enjoy beer. And if it's reasonably priced and not extreme, then I genuinely think that there is a bright future. But I do think brewers do need to, let's say it, rediscover beer.
Excellent summary there, Charlie. Well, I want to thank you for coming on today and sharing some of your personal story. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Brad.
My guest today, as I've said many times, one of my favorites, Dr. Charlie Bamforth, Professor Emeritus of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California at Davis. Thank you again, Charlie.
Yes.
Well, a big thank you to Charlie Bamforth for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And BeerSmith Web, the online version of BeerSmith brewing software. BeerSmith the Web lets you design great beer recipes from any browser, including your tablet or phone. Edit recipes on the go with access to the same full suite of recipe building tools as our desktop version. Try BeerSmith Web today by creating a free account at beersmithrecipes.com. And finally, a reminder to click that like and subscribe button on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or whatever platform you're on. Clicking those buttons is a great way to support the show. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.